All right, diving in today, folks, we're tackling Christ movements in the Hindu world. And to help us navigate this, well, let's just say very complex topic, we've got the work of H.L. Richard to guide us.
A solid choice. Richard's background is really something else. 10 years in India doing hands-on Christian ministry.
Yeah, boots on the ground, right?
Exactly. And then another 10 years dedicated to really getting to grips with Hinduism. Not just the theory, but how Christian communities are actually, living it out within that context.
A really unique blend of experience and scholarship, then. So for our listeners, what we're aiming for in this deep dive is to unpack how these movements towards Christianity have taken shape in India. Because, let's be honest, India's social and religious landscape, it's about as intricate as it gets.
No argument there. And the sources we're using offer some, I'd say, surprising glimpses into why some communities have been way more receptive than others.
Yeah.
There's some really unexpected factors in the mix.
Right, and that's precisely what we're digging into. So our mission, if you will, is to understand both the historical arc of these movements, like where they came from, and what's happening right now. Oh, and of course, got to look at the challenges they've faced and maybe even try to peek into the future a bit.
Sounds like a plan.
Now, let's start with something fundamental. The whole idea of people movements. I mean, where did that even come from?
Well, here's the thing, and this is kind of cool. It wasn't some Western idea imposed on India. Like, hey, let's get whole communities to switch religions. It actually came from observing what was already going on within Hindu communities.
Oh, so the concept itself emerged organically.
Exactly. Think of India's social structure, thousands of caste groups, as these existing networks, right? Pathways for a new faith to spread within those close-knit groups.
Makes sense, kind of like a ripple effect. But I'm guessing it's not quite that simple.
You got it. Richard points out that this very structure that helps spread within a group can also become a huge barrier between different castes. It's a real double-edged sword.
A paradox, almost. Okay, so let's trace the history here a bit. Richard mentions this big wave way back in the 15th century, a fisherman caste moving towards the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is it wasn't just a spiritual shift, it was deeply tied to politics. They were seeking support from the Portuguese, like a strategic alliance.
So maybe not a sudden aha moment of faith, but survival playing a role.
Could be. Then, of course, you have the rise of Protestant influence from the mid-18th century onwards.
Another distinct chapter for sure. But if we jump ahead to now, India's changing rapidly. What about these Dalit movements that Richard talks about?
Huge developments there. The Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, are driving significant protest and social advancement movements.
And these were initially linked with Christianity, right? But now it's broader.
You got it. It now includes folks drawn to Buddhism, even secular ideas. So the church is kind of one player in a bigger movement for social justice and equality.
Like, the river's found new channels. So geographically, where are these movements most concentrated? Richards mentions some government research from the 80s.
Yeah, they identified over 4,600 communities, and about 30% were Dalit and tribal. And here's the key takeaway. Those ongoing people movements towards Christianity, they're mostly happening within these groups.
And if you connect that to, well, the unfortunate reality of persecution of Christians in India, that's mostly concentrated in those same areas, right?
Exactly, suggesting a link between these shifts in faith and, well, social tension, you could say.
Makes you think. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How has the expression of the church itself changed during these movements?
At first, it was a lot of importing Western denominations. Not much blending with Indian culture, just kind of transplanting the structures.
But then in the 20th century, things started to change.
Yeah, you see the rise of what's called contextualization. Basically adapting how you present the gospel to fit the local culture.
So not just imposing Western norms, but making it resonate.
Exactly. And these newer church movements are more into this contextualization thing.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. It's still mainly within Dalit communities.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room. Why hasn't there been a bigger response from the, 70% of Hindus who aren't Dalit?
That's the million-dollar question. And Richard gets into some tough stuff here. One thing he calls out is the double stigma the Indian church faces. Firstly, a lot of resistance to anything seen as foreign, even with all the westernization around.
So the church gets lumped in with that.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the fact that the church is mainly Dalit. For a non-Dalit Hindu, joining could mean getting cut off from their family and community. Huge social cost.
A real barrier.
Mm.
He also mentions a lack of effort from Christians to really understand Hindu views.
Yeah, like there's this gap, and it needs traffic flowing both ways. Okay, now defining Hinduism itself is tricky, even before we get to the whole Christianity thing.
Right, it's not like Christianity with a neat set of core beliefs, no single theological checklist.
Precisely. Sure, there are schools of thought and traditions like Vaishnavism, focused on Vishnu and his avatars like Ram and Krishna. But even within Vaishnavism, you've got tons of denominations with their own little variations.
So it's decentralized, tons of variety. And what about those attempts to sum up Hindu teachings, like the paths of knowledge, action, and devotion? Do they work?
Not really. They create these divisions that don't match up with reality. Most Hindus blend all three paths, plus philosophy and devotional practices. It's a package deal.
And how about that Western image of Hinduism as all philosophical and detached?
Richard's pretty clear on that. While philosophy's there, especially in the texts and the whole New Age movement, it doesn't reflect most Hindus in India. For them, worshiping God, often with images, is central.
So the devotional aspect is key, which brings us to puja, right?
Right on. Puja basically means worship. It's daily practice at home, part of family life, and huge in temples. And Richard argues this shows how deeply theistic most Hindu faith is. It's about a divine reality, expressed in countless forms.
Which, of course, leads us to the tricky subject of idolatry.
Yeah, that's always a sensitive point. But Richard acknowledges using images in worship is fundamental for most Hindus. So, presenting Christ in this context is a balancing act. You got to stay true to the Bible, but also be respectful, especially towards elders who hold these traditions dear.
Delicate, for sure. And beyond rituals, what's the most valued spiritual attitude?
Bhakti. It means deep, heartfelt devotion to God. You might have rituals, even some superstition, but that loving devotion is the ideal. Even though some philosophies talk about detachment, bhakti and puja are what define Hindu religious life. Spirituality is basically God consciousness, fueling that devotion and worship.
Interesting. And this is where things get really interesting. Richard talks about some parallels and maybe some missed connections between Hinduism and Christianity.
Right. Because of that focus on bhakti, Hindus often have genuine respect for Jesus. But here's the thing, and Richard makes this point. Many forms of Christianity aren't seen as putting the same emphasis on worship and heartfelt devotion. It's like Christ is sidelined, and spirituality becomes intellectual, or just showing up on Sundays.
And there's that decline in focusing on Jesus's actual teachings, which Richard thinks pushes Hindus away.
If what you're calling Christianity doesn't seem big on devotion or following Jesus's words, why would a Hindu, with their strong bhakti, find it appealing? That brings us right back to contextualization.
So not transplanting Western Christianity, but
Planting the seed and letting it grow in Indian soil in ways that make sense for them. Richard talks about dharma duty, righteousness, the stuff that holds society together. He thinks Jesus' way fits with dharma, encouraging people to be humble and contribute to their families and communities, all within their existing social fabric.
points of agreement, not just disagreement. Now, India's social scene is changing. More individualism with urbanization, right?
True, but Hindus are still super interconnected. Family, extended family, caste community, it's all huge. And while caste has its dark side, the whole untouchability thing, which is officially a no-no, it's still sadly around in different ways.
Richard makes a point, though. Caste as identity isn't bad in itself.
Yeah, it's nuanced. Trying to wipe out caste hasn't really worked. Even reform movements in Hinduism, and get this, even some Christian denominations in India have ended up kind of mirroring caste structures. Is that ingrained?
And he mentions the growing influence of the other backward castes, the OBCs, and how Christian outreach to them has been limited.
Big point. The OBCs are a massive and growing part of India, gaining power. But historically, not many from these communities have turned to Christianity. So something to think about for the future.
And then there's that rise of Hindu nationalism, which can be quite exclusionary.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity. This group pushes Hinduism as the only true faith for India, not very tolerant of minorities. It makes things tougher for Christian outreach and peaceful interfaith stuff.
What about the global Hindu diaspora?
Mostly from higher castes, not much gospel impact there. But they're influential, financially strong. And Richard says their view of Hinduism is shaped by being minorities in other countries. So there's a huge opportunity for Christians worldwide to engage thoughtfully with Hindus, right where they are, neighbors, colleagues, you name it.
Untapped potential. So what's the hopeful vision for these movements going forward? Richard uses the term incarnational movements.
He thinks those principles that work for Dalits and tribal groups can work for higher castes, too. The key is the gospel spreading through those existing structures, those caste communities, not forcing people to abandon them.
And the way we present the gospel needs to adapt too.
Totally. It's got to resonate with Hindu worldviews, their dharma, their values, not just Western Christianity 2.0. Richard's optimistic about people and insider movements popping up all over. Basically, a biblical faith lived out within Hindu dharma and culture, embracing all that diversity. That's where he sees hope.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've covered a lot. The complex history of Christ movements in India, those social and religious factors that shaped them, the uphill battle of reaching non-Dalit Hindus, and the potential of a more contextual, culturally sensitive approach.
And that brings us to a final thought to chew on. Given how central bhakti, that devotion, is to Hinduism and the struggles of westernized Christianity in India, how might emphasizing Jesus' devotional side, his prayer, his compassion, his connection to the divine hit home for Hindus worldwide? Could that change things for interfaith understanding down the line? Something to ponder even after this deep dive is over.
Food for thought, folks. Thanks for joining us.